Hello, welcome to another episode of Bumbling Through Dungeons, the show that, true story, was going to be named Stumbling Through Dungeons until I realized that Stumbling Through Dungeons makes the acronym STD. Today we're going to be talking about Session Zero. What is it? Why do you need it? What should you put in it? Other questions. So let me tell you about my first campaign as a DM. I was going to be running a campaign with a group of good friends, and we had all gamed together in the past, mostly board games, things like that. And I was putting in a lot of prep into this, and we knew several months in advance that we were going to be starting this campaign. And I thought to myself, oh, this is an excellent opportunity to include all the Session Zero stuff into a document that I send to my friends, let them chew over for a number of months, talk amongst themselves, and then when we get to our first session at the table, we can just start rolling dice immediately. This was a mistake. Not because I didn't have a lot of good information that I included in the Session Zero document that I sent to my friends. It was a mistake because we didn't have a chance then at any point to sit down as a full group and discuss all of these things together and to talk through our characters and the campaign and the backstories and everything and how it all plays together. We didn't have a chance to discuss all of that together. It was always disjointed one-on-ones in the months leading up to the campaign. Now, that being said, the campaign went really well. Everyone had a lot of fun. I learned a lot as a DM. I think we had a blast at the table. It finished. We had minimal absences, so it went really well. But at the same time, I think we missed out on, especially early in the campaign, I think we missed out on some potential character beats and some potential ways that I could have catered the campaign to the characters because we didn't have that Session Zero where we talked through everything at the beginning. So what the heck is Session Zero? Well, a lot of you have been playing for a while will be familiar with it. If you're not, Session Zero is sort of a catch-all term for a lot of the things that happen prior to actually rolling dice and starting the game up and rolling dice. It can happen at the table, and oftentimes it does. That's why people call it a Session Zero. It's when you go over character creation and specifics of backstories, and you talk about the setting and the campaign and any house rules that you're doing and the logistics of when you're going to be meeting. So it's basically when you all get on the same page about what type of campaign this is going to be. So my number one piece of advice as it relates to Session Zeros is to have one. That seems relatively obvious saying it like that, but at the time I was so excited to jump into the campaign that I thought that we were going to be able to do everything we needed to with a Session Zero prior to that first actual meetup. And while some of that was able to happen prior to our first meetup, not all of it, and it wasn't handled in as satisfying a way as I think it can be if you're all collaborating at the table before you actually start the campaign. So what should you include in a Session Zero? Well, that's a good question, and the answer is potentially quite a lot. So there is a reason why Session Zero oftentimes is the entire first meeting of an RPG group. To get on the same page with anything and everything that you might want to, it can take some time. I don't think it necessarily needs to be an entire first session. Other Session Zeros that I've had that I think went really well took up maybe the first half hour to hour of our first meeting, and then we just had a shorter first session after that. But there is quite a bit that you can include in a Session Zero and then you can discuss that I think helps create a smoother experience once the campaign is going, so that a lot of the questions that players might have and a lot of the tension that might occur between DM and players who aren't on the same page is something that you get out of the way early on so you don't encounter it once you're in the campaign. So I'm going to pull up my laptop here that's right next to me and go through this document that you can see on your screen right now that includes a lot of different things that I like to talk about in my Session Zeros. Okay, so first and foremost, game expectations. What do you expect from your players? What should they expect from you? Establishing this is very important. Maybe you're a group that has been playing together for years and years and years, and you don't need to discuss this explicitly. But I think these are important things to keep in mind, and especially for newer groups and newer DMs, I think they're really great reminders of how you can be structuring your campaign to create an environment of mutual respect. So you can see the three that I included in my initial session 0 document here, and just some reminders for facilitating fun and collaboration at the table, and in an attempt to avoid some of the pitfalls that you hear about in some RPG groups that fall apart. So the first one, I promise to do my best to respect your time by being prepared to DM, not being maliciously unfair or playing favorites, and working to facilitate a smooth, fun, and collaborative experience. In return, I ask respect for the work being put into the campaign in the form of committing to participating as often as possible, being on time, communicating absences in advance whenever possible, and respecting your fellow players. I consider the entire group's fun to be my fun, and I hope the same will be true for all of you. Everyone will have their own things going on with the characters, but always remember that you exist in a group where everyone should have a chance to shine. Now, this is all paraphrased, I'm sure, from some other source that I saw somewhere else on the internet. At this point, I don't remember where, but I think it's an excellent way to frame a campaign and frame an RPG group. All right, so getting into the nuts and bolts of the campaign. Logistics. When are you going to meet? What is the start date going to be? Where are you going to meet? And the other thing too is, say you have to cancel 2 sessions in a row. Are you going to reschedule? When will you reschedule? These sorts of things are important to talk about early on to keep the campaign flowing. And lastly, food and drink. Not all groups are going to need to discuss this, but is it bring your own food and beverage? Will one person bring snacks for the group and then the next week it's somebody else's responsibility? Just discussing that beforehand, if applicable, is pretty cool. On the campaign itself, what system are you running? So a lot of this channel is about 5e D&D, so that's probably going to be it for many of you. But if you're the type of player that's running different systems, or maybe if you have a player who isn't used to current edition D&D, a reminder there is important so that they're not confused on exactly what's being run. The setting. Sometimes it's easy enough to just say, hey, it's a generic fantasy setting, ready, go. But a lot of times if you're running a homebrew setting, or say an alternate setting, maybe it's Dark Sun and it's post-apocalyptic, maybe it's Spelljammers, maybe it's Ravnica that just came out. There are a lot of different things, and the flavor of those settings all changes, and that can inform your players' decisions about their character. So I think it's important to include a little bit of information about the setting, just so that they know what type of world they're throwing their character into. And then campaign length. Now, it's pretty impossible to say for sure exactly how many sessions a campaign is going to take. And some campaigns start and they don't have a clear end goal. They don't have an end date. But a lot of times with homebrews, for example, you might have an arc that you've prepped and you can say, okay, I think it's going to take us about this many sessions. It might be a little bit less, might be a little bit more, but it's important to give your players a sense of the time commitment involved, unless it really is just an ongoing campaign that doesn't necessarily have an end date. The same is true of official adventures from Wizards of the Coast. So a lot of those you can sort of guesstimate and say, okay, here's how long I think it's going to take us, give or take. A lot of that depends on what the players do, how quickly the sessions go, how many times you have to cancel, that sort of thing. But giving your players a ballpark for how long it's going to take can help to create engagement and commitment from them. This next one here is one that I added on my own, freedom of choice. So this is something that I included in this particular document because this was for my first campaign as a DM. And one of the things that I was worried about was, oh my goodness, what if my players go off and just do something unexpected in session number 1 and I'm not prepped for it, and then all this stuff that I have prepped for the early sessions of the campaign is for nothing. So that was really something that was stressing me out a little bit, and I think it does for a lot of newer DMs who hear about players going way off the rails into places that you can never anticipate. But at the same time, I wanted my players to eventually have a level of freedom where they were the ones driving the campaign. And I was giving them plot hooks and story arcs and things like that, but they were the ones making the decisions of what to do, how to do it, where to go, and on what timeline to do it. And I was largely reacting to that. But I knew that I wasn't going to be comfortable doing that from the very beginning. So I communicated this to them, and I said, hey, the first handful of sessions are going to be fairly linear. Now, you're still going to have choice within that linear structure, but I'm going to give you a plot hook and please take it, is basically what I was asking them. And they were cool with this. They said, yeah, that's fine. You're putting in all this work. You're the DM. That's fine. but they also knew that I wanted it to be more of a sandbox, more of an open world by the end of the campaign. And it definitely was. So by the time we got like into the teens with our sessions, so by session like 12, 15, 20, it was very much character driven and player driven, not so much on a linear path that I had set out. But it really helped me to start on a more linear path through the first like 3 to 5 sessions and then slowly loosen those restrictions and give the players more choice gradually. So again, you may be a more experienced DM who doesn't need this, or it might be more fun to you to just throw the players into the world, see what they do, and react to that. That's perfectly valid. That's a great, really fun, exciting, sometimes scary way to run a game, but a lot of games are run like this. But whatever you're comfortable with, whatever type of campaign you want to run, just be clear with your players, and I think it'll help establish boundaries as you move through the campaign. So other campaign stuff, what level are you going to be starting at? That can affect character decisions. How are you going to handle experience? What's the pace of leveling going to be like? Is that something that you know? You might not at the very beginning, and that's fine. But is it going to be every time you kill a monster? Are you going to award XP for social encounters? Or is it just going to be milestone? So any of those are valid ways to handle it, but knowing how it will be handled is important. Also, establishing when a player misses, how are you going to handle experience? Will they not get experience? Will they get half experience? Will they get the same experience so that everyone stays on the same level progression? So these are decisions that you have to make. There's no right or wrong decision from among those, but it's important to establish one and then stick to it throughout a campaign. So these next couple questions are ones that I actually got from players right before we were starting the campaign. It was, what happens to PCs when a player's gone? And again, there are multiple correct answers to this, but establishing it at the beginning I think is important. Are you going to figure out narratively how that character is gone? Or are you just going to sort of hand wave it away and pretend like they're not there and everyone at the table just has that suspension of disbelief? Or are you as a DM or one of the players going to control that character when they're gone? And then a follow-up question that I got to that is, if I miss, can my character die? And for this particular campaign, I said, yes, absolutely. Now, I as a DM am not going to try to kill a player when they're absent. And other players certainly don't want to get a character killed when their player is absent either. But I think that tension that death creates in D&D is important to have in a lot of campaigns. So I said, yes, absolutely. If you miss, that risk doesn't go away for your character, which leads into a discussion about death in general in the game. So I think most D&D games include the possibility of death, include the possibility of TPK, but especially for newer groups who might not be used to that mechanic and might be used to, say, video gaming where you die and then you respawn right away. Just including it as a reminder can be really helpful, because there are players who get very invested in the characters that they create and in the story that's being told through their character. So the possibility that that story arc can just get cut short on a moment's notice can be very dramatic, but also very shocking to a lot of players. And I think just a reminder that yes, this is always a possibility is important. And then metagaming. So I personally don't have a problem with nearly any style of metagaming, but if you have rules about it or people want to have that discussion at the table, I think it's cool to have it at the beginning rather than once you're into the campaign. Speaking of rules, this next section is pretty short, but I think it's an important one, and that is, do you use any variant or house rules? And there are a few variant rules that I like to use from the DM's manual that I think work with my DMing style and play style a little bit better, but they are ones that most groups don't use. And there are very few groups that don't use any house rules whatsoever. So just making sure you talk about those beforehand, because especially if it comes up, say, in the middle of combat, that can be a bad time to have that discussion. So it's important to have it at the beginning. Character creation is another thing that you're probably going to be doing in your session 0 to some extent with players. So having that discussion is important. There are a few things I list out here that are, I think, good to at least mention. Are there any alignments that aren't allowed? Maybe you're running a very heroic campaign where evil aligned players and characters aren't going to make as much sense. So if that's the case, you might have that conversation with your players and say, hey, neutral alignment's okay, but we're not going to be doing evil characters. If you want to play an evil character, maybe we'll run something down the line where it'll be a little bit more morally nebulous. But making sure that the characters that they create are going to work in the campaign that's being run is very important. Factions. Factions are very prevalent in Adventurers League play. In Forgotten Realms, there are a handful of different factions that characters can join, and then they can climb up the ranks by doing certain things for those factions. Now, a lot of homebrew campaigns don't include much on the factions, or if they do, they only pay lip service to them in some of the longer official adventures from Wizards of the Coast. But maybe you want to use those. Maybe you want to create your own. And especially, say, if your characters are starting at level 3 or level 5, something other than level 1, they've been adventuring in the world for a while, and maybe they've come into contact with these factions and would have had access to them. So do you want those in your campaign? What are they? And which ones would your characters know about? Would your players know about? Giving them those options can add layers to their backstory if they choose to incorporate those into them. And then just some nuts and bolts stuff. How do you want to handle character attributes? Do you want to do a point buy? Do you want to do a standard array? Do you want your characters to roll for stats? Are you okay if the players roll for stats on their own, or do you need to be there for that? So again, just establishing all this beforehand is important. And then what books are allowed? Is it just the player's handbook? That's fine if it is. If that's all that you're comfortable using, just make sure that you're clear about that. So can they use anything that Wizards has come out with officially? Can they use Unearthed Arcana material? Can they use homebrew material from DM's Guild that they find? So wherever that line is, just make sure it's a clear line so that your players know what they do and don't have access to. And then finally, backstory. Now, you're not going to be dictating backstory to your players, but there are certain adventures that are narratively driven. They're driven by the plot. And I think any official adventure from Wizards of the Coast is sort of like this, where you can incorporate character elements, but the main plot of the story, of the adventure, is always going to be the focal point, unless you're one of these DMs that can just sort of go off on tangents for long periods of time. But if you're running the adventure as written, the plot is going to be the central focus the entire time. So there might be players who like to write a small novel about their character, and that's amazing. I love players like this because it gives you a lot of material to work with as a DM. But in a campaign like that, that's very plot driven, you might not have a chance to pull in a lot of those elements. So a lot of that work might go to waste, and that player might end up resenting the work that they did, and you don't want that. So being very clear about how open or narrow the plot and world of this adventure is going to be is important. And again, no matter how plot driven the adventure is, you can always include character elements, but in a very open world adventure where it's character driven and you're sort of reacting to their backstories and their decisions rather than driving the plot of the adventure as written. In those ones, you're going to be able to incorporate a lot more that the players give you. So there will be players who want to cater what they provide for you to the adventure, and having that discussion I think is real important. And then lastly on characters, in this first campaign, and actually in other campaigns too, I've kind of given my players the leeway to change things about their character early on. This is all the way up to being able to change their character to something different a handful of sessions in. So there are players who are brand new and they don't really know the game and they're not sure what they're going to like, so they might pick a character and 2 or 3 sessions in they might say, you know what, I'm just not feeling this. But at that point, if you're playing a campaign that's 30 sessions long, they could be stuck with that character for that long period of time, the next 27 sessions. So you don't want that to happen. So I like to give my players the opportunity to change things about the character that they have. Now, frankly, none of the players that I've played with have changed their entire character to a different one, but they have tweaked things. They have gone back and said, hey, I'm level 4 now, and this thing that I took at level 3, I don't think makes sense with where I want to take the character. Can I retroactively switch it to this other archetype or this other ability? And my answer to that is always yes. Your mileage may vary. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. But again, just be clear with your players beforehand. I think it's nice to have a little bit of leeway there at the beginning as players are figuring out their characters and how they fit within the group and within the campaign. And then lastly, are you providing any resources to your players to make things easier for them? You can see the handful that I provided to my players for this campaign. A fillable character sheet if they wanted to fill it out online instead of writing it out by hand. The basic rules for 5th edition, which Wizards of the Coast makes available for free, which is really nice if you're on a budget and don't have the player's handbook just yet. And I included a link to a point buy calculator so they could do their stats out online rather than having to write it out. And then the last 4 or 5 links here are just wiki links to either images or entries for different things within the campaign world. This was in the Forgotten Realms. We actually started in the city of Waterdeep in this particular campaign. And this was just information on that area of the world so that my players could go there, check out the lore, and if they wanted, they could incorporate that into their own backstories. So it allowed them to embed their characters a little bit more fully into the setting. And I am in communications and marketing, so I think it's always important to have a call to action when you want people to do something. So especially if you're sending your players anything beforehand or before the date of your first meetup, I think it's important to have a call to action, and that's what this last section is: next steps. So this is what I wanted the players to do next. Talk to your fellow players or to me with questions and comments on any of this. If you wish, collaborate with other players on character backstories, create a character, post it in the Facebook group, or send it to me. And I gave a date here. I gave them a deadline, and I think that helped to sort of establish, okay, this is when I need backstories by so that I can start to work it into the campaign. I think this was about a week before our first meetup, if I remember correctly. Then pick out your best non-cursed dice and be awesome. All right, that is it for session 0. I hope that you got a few ideas that you can incorporate into your own games and into your own session 0s or sessions 0. Not sure which of those is correct, but I do hope you got a couple ideas that you can incorporate that will really help facilitate a smooth experience at your table. And the other thing is, if there is anything that you think I missed, what is it? Let me know. Please put those down in the comments. I'd love to see them. So if there's anything that either you think I missed, or if there's something that you do that I didn't talk about that really helps you at the beginning of a campaign in your session 0s, I would love to hear those as well. Otherwise, best of luck in your own session 0s and in your campaigns, and I will see you next time.